They did not chain his hands, but fear bound his soul just the same. Peter stands in the courtyard of the high priest, close enough to see Jesus beaten, close enough to hear the accusations rising like smoke into the cold Jerusalem night, and yet far enough away to pretend he does not belong to him. A servant girl stares into the firelight and studies his face. Another voice joins hers. Then, another. The pressure closes in, and the man who once swore he would die before denying his Lord opens his mouth and says the unthinkable. I do not know the man. A rooster cries out into the darkness, and Peter breaks. The disciple who walked on water. The disciple who drew a sword in the garden. The disciple who said, even if I fall away, I never will. He is not standing before governors or armies. He is not facing chains or execution. He is standing before servants, strangers, flickering firelight, and the unbearable terror of being found out. That is what makes the moment so devastating. His greatest collapse did not happen under torture. It happened under pressure, under fear, under the sudden realization that devotion is easy to declare in the light and much harder to sustain in the dark. But what no one sees in that moment, not even Peter himself, is that something else has begun. Not triumph, not recovery, not yet. Something quieter, something deeper, something that feels, at first, like ruin, the shattering of self-confidence. The death of the version of Peter that thought love was proved by intensity alone. The man who believed courage came from impulse is about to discover a kind of strength that cannot be summoned by emotion, pride, or sheer force of will. This is the story of a disciple who loved Jesus sincerely and still failed him publicly. A man who was bold enough to step onto the sea and weak enough to crumble beside a fire. A man who spoke with fierce loyalty, stumbled with humiliating fear, and was met afterward not by rejection, but by a mercy deeper than his shame. Peter's greatest battle was never against Rome. It was never against priests, soldiers, or storms. It was against the unstable kingdom inside himself, against self-trust, against spiritual haste, against the dangerous belief that being passionate is the same as being prepared. He thought zeal meant strength. He was wrong. This is the story of how he was called, how he rose, how he presumed, how he fell, and how the risen Christ rebuilt him in the very place where his pride had died. How a broken promise became a doorway to deeper faith. How tears became truth. How surrender became the foundation of courage. How the man who once denied Jesus to save himself would later stand before crowds and councils with a steadiness no human confidence could have produced. Peter's story begins long before that courtyard, long before the rooster, long before the tears. It begins beside water, nets, work, weariness, the ordinary labor of men who knew fish, not theology, boats, not platforms, salt, not ceremony. Before Peter became a pillar of the early church, before he preached to thousands, before he was remembered as a leader, he was Simon, son of Jonah, a fisherman in Galilee. He was a working man under Roman occupation, living in a land heavy with longing. Israel was not free. The people knew the language of covenant, but they also knew taxation, military presence, public humiliation, and the ache of waiting for God to act. For generations they had carried promises in one hand and disappointment in the other. They remembered Moses. They remembered David. They remembered the prophets. But memory can become painful when hope takes too long. Rome ruled with visible power. Priests maintained visible order. And many ordinary people learned to live somewhere between outward religion and inward exhaustion. They still prayed. They still attended feasts. They still told the old stories. But beneath it all was a deep national hunger. Where was the kingdom? Where was the deliverer? Where was the day when God would move not in whispers, but in force? Into that world comes Jesus of Nazareth. And when he comes to Simon, he does not first meet him in a synagogue debate or at a place of public honor. He meets him in the place where Simon knows himself best, the place of labor, failure, and fatigue. Simon and the others have worked all night and caught nothing. That detail matters, because the first great turn in Peter's story does not happen when he feels competent. It happens when he is face to face with his limits. Jesus steps into Simon's boat and teaches the crowd from there. Then he says something that must have sounded almost unreasonable to a tired fisherman put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Simon answers with the honesty of experience. Master, we have worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. It is a small sentence, but it contains the entire weight of exhausted human knowledge. We tried. We know this water. We know this night. We know what failure feels like. And yet, Simon adds another line, the line that opens the future. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. That is one of the first signs of what makes Peter Peter. He is impulsive, yes. Strong in reaction, yes. But there is also something alive in him, something responsive, something capable of moving toward Jesus even before he fully understands him. The nets go down. The catch is overwhelming. The fish strain the cords, fill the boats, threaten to sink them. And suddenly Simon is no longer just a fisherman standing inside a miracle. He is a sinner standing in the presence of holiness. Go away from me, Lord, he says. I am a sinful man. That response is crucial. Peter's first deep encounter with Jesus does not inflate him. It exposes him. Grace often does that. Real encounter does not flatter the self. It reveals it. One sees abundance, but what he feels is unworth and ends. He sees power, but what he knows is his own smallness. And Jesus answers not by stepping back, but by calling him forward. Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people. Calling, not earned, not mastered, given. Simon leaves the nets, leaves the boats, leaves the old measure of success. And from that point on, he will be drawn into a life that repeatedly reveals both the beauty of his devotion and the instability of his heart. He is not chosen because he is already finished. He is chosen while he is still raw. That matters, because one of the deepest patterns in Scripture is that Jesus does not wait for perfected people before calling them. He calls people into a road where their flaws will be revealed in the light of his presence. As Simon walks with Jesus, something happens that no one around him can ignore. He is not the quietest disciple. He is not the most restrained. He is often first to speak, first to react, first to answer, first to interrupt, first to promise. He has a kind of spiritual forward motion that is both compelling and dangerous. When Jesus teaches hard things, when others hang back, he leans in. When confusion rises, he often gives voice to what the others are too uncertain to say. That is part of why his story is so moving. He is not cold. He is not cynical. He does not fail because he does not care. He fails, in part, because feeling strongly is not the same thing as being inwardly formed. The first great signs of Peter's future strength appear early. He sees miracles. He watches lepers cleanse, paralytics rise, demons flee, storms obey. He watches loaves multiply in the hands of Jesus. He walks through villages where death loses ground and despair gives way. And with every display of power, the question grows, who is this man? One day Jesus asks his disciples directly, "Who do you say that I am?" Simon answers with a clarity that feels heaven-sent. "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." It is one of the great confessions in the Gospels. Jesus blesses him, says flesh and blood did not reveal this to him, but the Father in heaven. It looks like arrival. It sounds like certainty. It feels like Simon has stepped fully into the role he was made for. Jesus even gives him a new name with public weight, Peter. Rock. And yet, The story turns almost immediately, because right after Peter speaks revelation, he begins to speak from his own natural mind. Jesus starts telling them that he must suffer, be rejected, be killed, and be raised. Peter cannot bear it. The Messiah is supposed to rise, not fall, to conquer, not be crucified, to reign visibly, not be handed over. So Peter takes Jesus aside and rebukes him. Think about the nerve of that moment. The disciple who just spoke a truth from heaven now speaks against the very mission of heaven. That is how quickly spiritual perception can become spiritual presumption when the self is still too alive. Jesus turns and says words severe enough to stop the heart. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. That moment matters because it introduces one of the deepest engines of Peter's arc. He can receive real revelation and still revert quickly to self-shaped understanding. He can speak something true and then immediately resist the path that truth requires. He loves Jesus, but he still loves a version of strength that avoids weakness, humiliation, and surrender. He wants glory without the cross, and as long as that remains true, he will remain vulnerable in ways he cannot yet see. Still, the story does not move in a straight line from error to failure. Peter continues walking with Jesus. He continues witnessing wonders, and sometimes he becomes the stage on which his own contradiction is displayed most vividly. One night the disciples are in a boat on a rough sea. The wind is against them. The water is unstable. Then Jesus comes toward them, walking on the waves. Fear strikes the boat. They think it is a ghost. Jesus calls out, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Peter answers with a line that captures both the beauty and danger of his spirit. "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus says, "Come." Peter steps out. For a moment, he does what should not be possible. He walks toward Jesus on the sea itself. That scene has astonished readers for centuries, and rightly so. But what makes it so important in the architecture of Peter's story is not only that he walks. It is why he sinks. As long as his attention is fixed on Jesus, the impossible becomes reality under his feet. But when he sees the wind, he becomes afraid, and beginning to sink, he cries out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reaches out his hand and catches him. Peter is not the disciple who stayed safely in the boat. He is the one who stepped out and faltered, the one who dared greatly and then trembled, the one who moved toward Christ with genuine longing but could not sustain the gaze. This is Peter in miniature. Faith mixed with instability, love mixed with fear, boldness mixed with collapse. And that mixture is going to matter later, because the courtyard denial is not a random contradiction. It is the matured form of a pattern already present. He can move beautifully toward Jesus and still lose footing when pressure becomes personal. The pattern continues in subtler ways. Peter is present at moments of extraordinary privilege. He sees Jairus' daughter raised. He is taken up the mountain of transfiguration, where Jesus' glory flashes before human eyes. Moses and Elijah appear. The cloud overshadows them. The voice of the Father speaks. And what does Peter do in that moment? He speaks too quickly again. "Lord, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters." He does not yet know what to do with glory except react to it. He wants to contain it, structure it, honor it in a way he can manage. Peter's problem is not indifference. It is reflexive self-insertion. Even in holy moments, his first instinct is often to move before he has fully listened. That impulse will cost him dearly later, because spiritual danger does not always come from gross rebellion. Sometimes it comes from the habit of reacting from self before waiting in surrender. As the ministry of Jesus moves toward Jerusalem, the pressure increases. The miracles remain, but so do the warnings. Opposition sharpens. Tension rises. The language of Jesus grows darker, clearer, more insistent about suffering ahead. And still the disciples, Peter included, struggle to understand. They are near Jesus, but not yet ready for the kind of kingdom he is actually bringing. Then comes the Last Supper. Jesus speaks openly about betrayal, scattering, denial, the coming darkness. The room is thick with lavender knees. He washes feet. He breaks bread. He speaks of laying down his life. And Peter, hearing all this, responds in the way Peter so often does with fierce declaration. Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. That line is not fake. It is sincere. And that is precisely why it hurts. Peter means it. He believes it. He feels his loyalty intensely enough that he cannot imagine failing. But sincerity is not the same as stability. Emotion is not the same as tested obedience. Jesus answers him with a prophecy that cuts straight through confidence. Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Imagine the blow of that sentence. Peter does not yet know himself deeply enough to believe Jesus. That is one of the most painful dimensions of spiritual formation. There are truths about our weakness that can be spoken to us clearly and still remain unreal until failure exposes them. Peter hears the warning, but he answers it with contradiction. Even if everyone else falls away, he will not. He places himself above the drift of others, above the weakness of the group, above the possibility of collapse. He does not yet know how much self-confidence is mixed into what feels like devotion. And this is how major downfalls often begin. Not with hatred of God, not with open rebellion, but with overconfidence, with the hidden belief that because we love strongly, we will therefore stand surely. Peter's problem is not lack of affection for Jesus. It is trust in his own capacity to remain loyal when tested. Then the garden comes. Gethsemane is one of the most revealing settings in the entire story because it strips away public energy and leaves only the soul under pressure. Jesus tells Peter, James, and John to stay awake and pray. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That sentence is the diagnosis of Peter before Peter understands it. And what happens? He sleeps. Then again. This is not a minor detail. Before Peter denies Jesus with his mouth, he fails him with his vigilance. Before he collapses in public, he drifts in private. He cannot sustain watchfulness in the hour when watchfulness is most needed. That is important because when the crisis finally arrives, Peter will not enter it spiritually awake. He will enter it tired, reactive, unguarded, and leaning on passion he is mistaken for preparedness. Then soldiers come, torches, weapons, Judas, chaos. And suddenly Peter does what he does so often: he moves fast. He draws a sword and strikes the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. There it is again. The same pattern. He cannot stay awake when Jesus tells him to pray, but he can swing steel when events become dramatic. That contrast is devastating. Peter is ready for a kingdom of immediate action, not a kingdom of surrendered trust. Jesus rebukes him, puts the ear back, drinks the cup the Father has given him. And now the collapse begins for real. Jesus is taken away. The disciples scatter. Peter follows at a distance. That phrase matters. At a distance. Not done. Not faithful in nearness. Somewhere in between. He still wants to say. He still wants connection. He still cares. But fear has already begun rearranging the geography of his loyalty. He wants Jesus close enough to watch, far enough to survive. And many failures begin exactly. They're not in total abandonment, but in the attempt to keep some relationship with truth while protecting the self from its cost. He enters the courtyard. It is cold. A fire burns. The atmosphere is thick with danger. Jesus is inside being questioned. Peter is outside trying to remain unnoticed. The disciple who once declared his readiness to die is now managing exposure. A servant girl looks at him. You also were with Jesus of Galilee. Peter denies it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about. He moves toward the gateway. Another girl sees him. This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again he denies it, with an oath. I don't know the man. A little later those standing there come up to Peter. Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then Peter begins to call down curses, and he swears to them, I don't know the man. And immediately the rooster crows. This is one of the most painful progressions in all Scripture. The denial escalates line by line. It is not one accidental sentence. It is a staircase downward. First discomfort, then distance, then oath, then cursing. Pressure does not create a new Peter in the courtyard. It reveals how much fear still governs him when disrespect becomes personally dangerous. Then Jesus turns and looks at Peter. That look is one of the most devastating and mysterious moments in the Gospels. We are not told every shade of it. We are not given the exact expression. But whatever it holds, it reaches Peter completely. Memory returns. The words of Jesus return. The illusion of self-confidence shatters. Peter goes outside and weeps bitterly. There is no defense now. No speech. No sword. No argument. No comparison with weaker disciples. Only truth. This is the real beginning of Peter's transformation. Not his confession. Not his enthusiasm. Not even his miraculous moments. Those mattered. But this matters differently. Because here Peter is finally separated from the false image of himself. The man who thought he could promise from his own strength now knows what he really is without grace. Bitter tears are not yet restoration, but they are the death of illusion. And illusion must die before durable courage can live. Then comes the cross. The one Peter said he would follow unto death goes alone. Condemned, mocked, crucified. The sky darkens. The earth trembles. Hopes collapse. And somewhere inside Peter all the weight of his failure settles deeper. Jesus is not merely arrested. He is dead. And Peter did not stand. He did not confess. He did not go to prison with him. He did not die beside him. He did exactly what he said he never would. Think of the torment of that silence. He had seen Jesus raise the dead. He had heard promises of the kingdom. He had called him the Son of the living God. And now the Messiah hangs on a cross, buried in a tomb, and Peter's last public relationship to him is denial. This is where many stories would end. Not with redemption, but with permanent shame. The disciple who failed to publicly. The promise that broke to completely. The witness disqualified by his own mouth. That the kingdom of God does not move according to the logic of finality that human shame prefers. The resurrection is coming. And with it comes a question even more piercing than Peter's failure. What does Jesus do with disciples who truly love him and still collapse under fear? On the third day, the women go to the tomb. It is empty. There is confusion, running, astonishment. Peter and John race there. Peter enters the tomb and sees linen lying there. The body is gone. The old categories cannot hold what is happening. Something impossible has happened, but Peter is not yet restored simply because the tomb is empty. Resurrection is objective good news. Yes, but Peter still carries a personal wound that has not been directly touched. Jesus is alive. Wonderful. But what does that mean for the disciple who denied him? That is one of the most important tensions the scriptural story leaves hanging. Resurrection does not erase Peter's memory. It intensifies it. Because now the one he failed is alive again. Then comes one of the most quietly hopeful details in the Gospel of Mark. The angel tells the women, go, tell his disciples and Peter. And Peter, named specifically, not erased into the group, not forgotten, not allowed to wonder forever whether he has already been set aside. Grace does not avoid the fallen disciple. It addresses him. It names him. It reaches toward him before he knows what to do with himself. Still, Peter is not immediately shown fully restored. The story continues through uncertainty, through waiting, through that strange in-between season where Jesus is risen, But the future is not yet settled in Peter's heart. And then the narrative does something remarkable. It takes Peter back to water. "I'm going out to fish," he says. The others go with him. They fish all night and catch nothing. That should sound familiar. The story is circling back to its beginning. Back to boats, night, emptiness, labor without result. That repetition is not accidental. Peter, after failure, has drifted toward old patterns, old spaces, old identities. Not because the coal is gone, but because the heart often retreats toward what feels known when it does not yet know how grace will reassemble the future. The risen Jesus stands on the shore, though they do not realize it is him, and asks whether they have any fish. No. He tells them to throw the net on the right side of the boat. They do. The catch surges. At once the memory awakens. John says, "It is the Lord." And Peter being Peter, throws himself into the water and heads toward Jesus. That detail is perfect. He still moves fast toward the one he loves. The affection is real. The longing is real. But now something else is present to shame. Memory. Unfinished sorrow. When they reach shore, what do they find? A coal fire. That detail is devastating and deliberate. The only other charcoal fire in the Gospels burns in the courtyard of Peter's denial. Jesus is rebuilding Peter not in abstraction, but in the very sensory terrain of his collapse. The smell, the flame, the atmosphere. Grace is not pretending the failure never happened. It is meeting Peter in the place where it happened and transforming its meaning. After breakfast, Jesus turns to Simon Peter and asks, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" The question is surgical. Not "Are you sorry?" Not "Can you explain yourself?" Not "How could you?" He goes beneath the collapse to the deepest matter. Love. Peter answers, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Then again, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Tend my sheep." A third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter is hurt because Jesus asks him the third time. Of course he is. The repetition burns because it mirrors the three denials. But this is not cruelty. It is restoration by correspondence. The wound was made in threes. The healing now arrives in threes. Jesus is not humiliating Peter. He is recommissioning him in the exact place where shame claims authority. Each question reopens the denied relationship. Each answer is a chance to speak truth where fear once spoke falsehood. Each commission declares that Peter's failure, the real, is not final. Notice what Jesus does not say. He does not say Peter's sin was nothing. He does not flatter him back into leadership. He does not restore him by pretending the denial did not matter. He restores him by bringing him through it, by letting love answer where fear once answered, and by tying restored love directly to responsibility. Feed my sheep. This is astonishing. The man who could not stay faithful beside a courtyard fire is entrusted with the flock of Christ. That does not happen because failure is unimportant. It happens because grace, when it truly remakes a person, can transform even the place of deepest shame into the ground of deepest ministry. Peter will now shepherd others not as a man who thinks himself incapable of falling, but as a man who knows what it is to be carried by mercy. Then Jesus says something else. He speaks of a day when Peter will stretch out his hands and be led where he does not want to go. He is telling Peter what kind of death will glorify God. Think about the reversal in that. Peter once swore he would die for Jesus and then failed before a servant girl. Now Jesus calmly tells him that one day he actually will go where earlier he could not. Not by impulse, not by bravado, not by self-generated courage, but because the man who has been broken and restored can now be formed into something steadier than emotional promise. And then Jesus says, "Simply follow me." That command lands differently now than it did beside the boats the first time. At the beginning, Peter followed with zeal and untested confidence. Now he is being asked to follow with humility, with memory, with a broken heart that has been met by mercy. He no longer follows as the disciple who thinks he is naturally stronger than the rest. He follows as a man who knows he cannot stand for 1 hour without grace. That is not the end of Peter's story. It is the beginning of his true strength, because when the Spirit comes at Pentecost, we see something that explains the whole arc. The same Peter who once trembled in a courtyard now stands publicly before a crowd in Jerusalem and lifts his voice. He speaks of Jesus crucified and risen. He does not hide his affiliation. He does not dilute the message to protect himself. He does not stand because he has become naturally fearless. He stands because the Spirit has done what self-confidence never could. The man who once said too much from himself now speaks with power from God. The man who once collapsed under the gaze of strangers now proclaims Christ before thousands. 3,000 are added that day. Do not miss the beauty of that contrast. In the courtyard, Peter's mouth became the instrument of denial. At Pentecost, his mouth becomes the instrument of proclamation. The failure has not merely been forgiven. It has been transformed. God does not simply erase Peter's weakness. He takes the place of weakness and makes it serve a new purpose. And the pattern continues. Peter and John stand before the Sanhedrin, the very sort of authorities that once terrified the disciples. They are warned not to speak in the name of Jesus. Peter answers with clarity. We cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. There is no courtyard distance here. No attempt to preserve the self. Something has changed all the way down. But even now, Peter's greatness is not perfection. It is dependence. He remains a real human being. Later, Paul will oppose him publicly in Antioch when Peter acts out of fear of others. That detail matters too. Peter is restored, transformed, empowered, but not turned into a machine. The story is not that grace makes human weakness vanish forever. It is that grace reorients the center. Peter is no longer governed by the illusion that he can stand by natural force. The boast has died. The dependence remains. That is why, years later, when Peter writes to suffering believers, his voice sounds the way it does. He speaks not as a man theorizing about pressure, but as one who knows what fear can do when it is allowed to rule the soul. He tells believers to be sober-minded, to be watchful, to cast their anxieties on God, to stand firm in grace. Those are not abstract instructions. They are the fruit of his own story. He once slept instead of watching. He once let anxiety and fear rule the moment. He once discovered the disaster of self-trust. Now he writes from the far side of mercy. And perhaps that is the deepest secret in Peter's life. His usefulness to the kingdom does not come from having the cleanest record among the disciples. It comes from having been undone, exposed, and rebuilt around the mercy of Christ. The church would not be strengthened by a Peter who never failed. It would be strengthened by a Peter who failed terribly unlearned where real strength lives. Peter's story is both warning and comfort. It is a warning because love for Jesus is not enough if it remains mixed with self-reliance. Zeal is not the same as preparedness. Big words are not the same as deep formation. We can confess profound truths one moment and resist the path of God the next. We can step out in faith and still sink when fear captures our attention. We can promise loyalty and then, without vigilance and prayer, collapse under pressure we once thought beneath us. Peter teaches us that a disciple can be sincere and still unstable. He teaches us that overconfidence is one of the most dangerous forms of spiritual weakness because it rarely feels like weakness when it begins. It feels like devotion. It feels like certainty. It feels like strength. But his story is also comfort because Jesus does not cast Peter off at the point of failure. He does not say, "You denied me, therefore your calling is cancelled." He lets Peter feel the bitterness of truth. He lets illusion die. He lets the tears fall. But then he comes back for him, names him, feeds him, questions him, restores him, recommissions him, and in doing so, he reveals something breathtaking about the heart of God. Our deepest failures are not stronger than resurrection. What if the place in your life that most embarrasses you is the very place where Jesus intends to meet you most personally? What if the thing that shattered your self-image is also the thing that could free you from self-trust? What if the reason some promises collapse is because God means to build something deeper than promise-making? What if the courage you keep trying to generate through intensity can only be received through surrender? Peter's story says this with painful clarity. You can love Jesus sincerely and still fail him grievously. But it also says this with even greater hope: failure, when brought into the light of the risen Christ, does not have to become your final name. There is a shadow of something even greater running through Peter's story. In the courtyard, Peter stands near a fire and denies his Lord to save his own life. At another fire, the risen Christ restores him by grace. Between those fires stands the cross, where Jesus does what Peter could not do. Jesus remains faithful where Peter collapsed. Jesus drinks the cup Peter could not drink. Jesus goes all the way into death without flinching, so that weak disciples who break under fear can still be forgiven, restored, and remade. That is the deeper glory here. Peter's story is not finally about Peter's resilience. It is about Christ's faithfulness. The church is not built on a naturally unbreakable man. It is built on a broken man held together by an unbreakable Savior. And maybe that is why Peter continues to speak so powerfully across the centuries. Because so many people know what it is to mean what they say in one moment and fail in the next. So many know what it is to promise faithfulness and then discover how fragile they really are. So many know what it is to weep outside their own courtyard, shocked by what came out of their mouth, by how quickly fear rearranged their loyalties, by how far they were willing to step back when the cost became real. Peter is their mirror, but he is also their hope, because the same Jesus who looked at Peter in the moment of collapse also cooked breakfast for him on the shore. The same Lord who foretold the denial also prepared the restoration. The same Christ who heard the oath, saw the tears, endured the cross, and rose again did not waste Peter's failure. He transformed it into the very place where humility, compassion, and courage could be born. So was Peter a rock or a ruin? In one sense, he was both. He was unstable when he trusted himself. He became steady when he was rebuilt by grace. That is the paradox. The rock was not the man untouched by weakness. The rock was the man who had learned it where weakness must go. And that lesson is not ancient only. It is painfully present. How many believers speak with conviction in safe places and go silent in costly ones? How many confuse intensity with maturity? How many love Christ and still lean more on personality than prayer, more on reaction than watchfulness, more on self than spirit? How many think the real danger is public opposition when the deeper danger is still private self-trust? Peter's life answers with sobering force. The distance between bold words and bitter tears can be shorter than anyone imagined. But it also answers with hope no shame can finally erase. The distance between bitter tears and restored purpose can be crossed by the mercy of the risen Christ. The disciple who once said, "I do not know the man," would later spend the rest of his life making that man known. That is not human recovery. That is resurrection power working through humbled clay. So if you are standing in the shadow of your own failure right now, remember Peter. Remember the courtyard. Remember the tears. Remember the empty tomb. Remember the charcoal fire on the shore. Remember that Jesus is able to return to the exact places where your strength failed, and ask a deeper question than your shame wants to answer. Not first, why did you fall? But, do you love me? And if you do, then the story is not over. Because Peter's legacy was not that he never broke. It was that he was restored. Not that he was always brave, but that grace taught him a courage self-confidence never could. Not that he never denied, but that he was brought back, and once brought back, he strengthened others. Maybe you are in your own courtyard now, trying to stay close enough to Jesus to feel connected, but far enough away to feel safe. Maybe you know what it is to follow at a distance. Maybe you know what it is to speak less clearly than you once did, to shrink back, to protect your image, your comfort, your place. Maybe the firelight has already exposed things in you that you did not want to see. Peter's story is for you. And maybe you are beyond the courtyard. Maybe you are already outside, weeping bitterly over something you said, something you did, some moment when fear made a coward out of love. Peter's story is still for you, because Jesus did not finish with Peter at the point of his worst moment, and he is not finished with all who still come to him empty-handed, unable to defend themselves, but willing to be remade. The gospel does not say, "Be stronger next time." It says, "Look at the one who remained faithful when you did not." It says, "Come to the shore." It says, "Let grace ask you deeper questions." It says, "Follow me again." Peter began beside a boat with empty nets. He was broken beside a fire in a night of fear. He was restored beside another fire in the light of resurrection. And from there he became what his own willpower never could have made him: a shepherd shaped by mercy, a witness made steady by grace, a servant whose courage no longer depended on the illusion of personal strength. So if this story found you where you are weak, stay there for a moment. Do not rush past it. Do not hide it with louder words. Do not cover it with the performance of certainty. Let the illusion die if it must. Let the tears come if they need to. Better the bitter truth that leads to Christ than the polished confidence that keeps you from him. Because the same Lord who let Peter break is the Lord who rebuilt him. And the same mercy that met Peter in the ruins still meets broken disciples now. Your worst night does not have to become your final name. Your failure does not have to become your identity. And the place where you discovered you are weaker than you thought may become the very place where Christ becomes more precious than you ever knew. Peter's story moved from calling to collapse, from boast to bitter tears, from firelight denial to shoreline restoration, from instability to courage. But it did not end in shame. It ended in witness. It ended in service. It ended in a life so transformed by grace that the man who once could not stand before a servant girl would one day stand before rulers and refuse to stop speaking the name he once denied. That is what Jesus does. He does not merely forgive the broken. He remakes them. He does not merely cover shame. He turns it into humility that can carry love. He does not merely erase the past. He folds even the ruins into the testimony of his faithfulness. So remember this: a promise can break. A disciple can fall. A heart can fail under pressure. But resurrection can still come looking for the one who wept outside. And when it does not come merely to comfort. It comes to restore, to commission, to deepen, to make all things new. If this message spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that failure is not always final. Someone who still thinks their worst moment disqualified them. Someone who is still standing at a distance because they do not know whether grace would still have them. Peter's life says it clearly: the risen Christ still walks toward broken disciples, still lights fires on cold shores, still asks healing questions, and still turns ashamed mouths into fearless witnesses. Peter was not remembered because he was flawless. He was remembered because he was restored. And that same restoration is still possible for all who love Christ enough to let him undo them and rebuild them. So if you have been following from a distance, come closer. If you have wept outside your own courtyard, do not stay there forever. If your confidence has collapsed, let something better be built in its place. And remember this: the rooster may expose you, but it does not get the final word. The final word belongs to the risen Christ, who still knows how to turn denial into devotion, fear into witness, and broken disciples into living stones.